Hey, what's up? It's Chris from Tiny Industrial RV Edition, and this is my motorhome. It is a motorhome, and in this two-part series, I'm going to tell you what to look for, what to avoid, and just things that you should really pay attention to if and when you're looking to buy one of these bad boys. I'm going to talk about the motor part of the motorhome. I'm going to talk about the home part of the motorhome. In other words, the mechanicals and then the interior. So let's get started with part one. So the number one thing that most people tend to look at when they're buying a vehicle is the mileage. And that's really no different for a vehicle of this type. There is a caveat though. The higher the mileage, the less risk averse you have to be. People get squeamish when something has 100,000 miles on it, something has 200,000 miles on it. Look at the mileage by all means, but keep this in mind. When you're dealing with an RV of this type of vehicle does not get used to go buy groceries. You don't run to 7-Eleven in this thing to buy yourself a Slurpee. This thing spends most of its time invariably, safe assumption to make, on the highway. Now, America's highways aren't in the best shape, but the transmission isn't constantly shifting. People aren't constantly, stopping, going. You're not on the brakes all the time. Those types of aspects that put strain on both the engine, the drivetrain, the transmission, the suspension for that matter, aren't as critical in one of these. So by all means, look at the mileage and start at that point, but keep in the back of your head that a higher mileage vehicle is not necessarily a bad thing. All right, the second thing to keep in mind with a motorhome is the tires. Now the tires will tell you a couple different things. The tires will tell you, has it been used a lot? In other words, what's the tread depth on the tire? Tires can look good visually. In other words, they can have a lot of tread depth. This particular vehicle happens to have 6 tires. They're big tires, they're expensive tires. On a vehicle like this, you may not get somebody using the vehicle that often, but the tires are still aging. They deteriorate. It's especially true when the sun hits the tires. So if you're in a warmer climate like Florida down south, out west where it's dry, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and so forth, what can happen is that the tires can, on first inspection, look quite good because you're looking at the tread depth. But on second inspection, when you get close to them, you'll see little cracks in the rubber, particularly on the sidewall. This happens when that tire is exposed to UV radiation. The rubber starts to break down, it starts to deteriorate, starts to soften up, starts to crack. And that can be a real problem over time. It can pose a real problem and a danger if you're driving this vehicle any sort of distance. Now, when I bought this particular vehicle, the tires were in bad shape. Not because they were lacking in tread depth. They had plenty of tread depth. They looked great. But when you got up close to the tire, you could see that they were drying out and that it was starting to crack. Now, there is an indicator on the tire, and I'll show a close-up in the video, but you're looking for a small round circle on the tire itself, which will indicate to you the manufacture date of the tire. And you'll be able to tell if a tire is 2 years old, 5 years old, 10 years old. Also, what can happen is if a vehicle like this sits for any length of time because it's incredibly heavy, some of the tire pressure may go down. The vehicle may sit on a partially deflated tire. And what happens is if that happens for too long, the tire can start to take on that shape of, you can reinflate the tire, you can start driving, but it might have this little like, so keep that in mind when you're looking at tires, very important. Next thing you want to look at when you're visually inspecting one of these things and you're taking a closer look at it is look under here, right? You're going to want to look for any kind of wet spots. Don't confuse condensation from the air conditioning system. So if it's been running for a while, you know, you get that drip of water from the condensation of the AC. That's not a big deal. That's actually what's going on down there at the moment, if you can see that. But look for anything like that under the vehicle. That is a bad sign. It's not necessarily a sign that you shouldn't buy it, but it's something to be aware of. And if there's something that needs to be fixed there, you need to obviously calculate that into your offer and the purchase price of the vehicle. Look for rust. Any kind of significant rust. Surface rust is fine. When I say significant rust, I'm talking about where, you know, flakes of metal are starting to come off, like large, you know, sort of quarter-sized chunks of metal. If something is completely rusted through, avoid that like the plague. Again, very heavy vehicle. What you don't want is a weakened chassis. That's what supports this thing. That's what that's what's holding everything together. If that's rusted very badly, then avoid the purchase of that vehicle, I would say. Now, that said, a lot of people don't use their RVs in the winter when you would be getting salt and snow and things like that underneath there. I think it's somewhat rare to find an RV that's completely rusted out underneath, but it's not impossible. So get into the vehicle, start the vehicle. It should start easily, it should start readily. There should be no hesitation, no weird clanking sounds when it starts and so forth. It should run fine. There shouldn't be any, you know, janglies, wiggling, whatever. Nothing like that should be going on. Turn the wheel. Does the wheel turn fine? Yes, very important. If you hear any squeaking, squealing, that could be an issue with the steering components. Pop the hood. Pop the hood. Does everything look okay here? And obviously ask questions of the person that's selling this unit to you. Take a look at the oil, make sure there's enough oil. If you really don't feel comfortable getting into that level of things, I would highly encourage you to hire a mechanic for that portion of it. Now, for the most part, those folks are going to be looking at the mechanical aspects, especially if it's not an RV specific mechanic. But if you do go to an RV service center, they'll also obviously be able to help you with the rest of the RV, the home portion of the motorhome, and be able to give you some insight into the tanks, the water pump, and all that kind of stuff. So you might be able to kill two birds with one stone is what I'm getting at. Short of that, like I said, take it to any kind of good mechanic. Now, a unit like this, you probably have to go to a sort of more heavy duty shop, one that works on trucks or similar, and they'll be able to give you some insight into the mechanical aspects of this unit. So once it's been running for a while, make sure that there's no lights on the gauge. Look for any kind of issues around, you know, oil pressure low. Make sure that the alternator is producing electricity. There's usually a gauge for that. So if you see nothing there, go on and test all the interior components, especially things like air conditioning. Make sure that cycles on and off. You're definitely going to want that. And yeah, just basically take a look around. Definitely take it for a test drive and see how it feels on the road. This particular unit had issues with the front shock absorbers, and that was something that, you know, was impossible to tell until I got it out on the road. They were very loose. There was a lot of sort of bounce and wobble on the front end of this thing, which, you know, led me to believe, yeah, I'm going to need new shock absorbers pretty quickly in here. But yeah, that is really it in a nutshell, I would say, in terms of the mechanical aspects. If the test drive goes well, if everything feels tight, the steering feels tight, if the transmission is shifting properly and as you would expect it to, the brakes feel solid and bring the vehicle to a stop without it pulling to one side or another, the suspension feels okay, you know, you've kind of checked all the various boxes at that point in terms of the mechanical overview. You know, this is all just kind of standard stuff that applies to any vehicle purchase, but it's no different really with a motorhome. This vehicle had 16,000 miles on it when I bought it, and that gave me a lot of confidence that there wouldn't be too many mechanical issues with it. That said, it was a 14-year-old vehicle, so you know, even a 14-year-old vehicle that isn't driven that much can develop issues. The gaskets and so forth can dry out. I hope that's helpful. That's what I would look for if I was shopping for a motorhome. The budget that you have to spend plays a role in all this, because the lower your budget, the more, you know, caveats and issues you have to be willing to accept, I would say. You know, if you have an unlimited budget, go ahead and spend $200,000 on some Mercedes-Benz based chassis. Again, it's no guarantee that that thing is going to work flawlessly for you. It does give you some peace of mind. Now, if your budget is lower, like mine was, you're going to want to be a little bit more thorough in terms of how you check it out. So let me give you one final tip that really has nothing to do with the mechanicals of a vehicle like this, but I think is really important, or it's become very important to me, and that is look at the number of owners the vehicle has had. If you can find a single owner vehicle, it makes it that much easier to know the history of the vehicle, and you're able to see how that particular owner took care of the vehicle. This typically will make me feel much more comfortable. Like, let's say a vehicle has a high mileage. If this thing had 150,000 miles, single owner, you know, and they're recounting, oh yeah, we took it out to California, and then we drove to Florida, and then we did this, and then we did that, and then, you know, I had this repaired and I had this replaced. Like, that gives me so much more comfort, especially if the vehicle like looks great, runs great. It just means that the person took care of it. All right, so I hope that's been helpful. Please hit the like button, subscribe if you're interested, and move on to part 2 of this series, which is the interior portion, the home part. See you in the next video. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.